It was one of those nights you don't forget. Thunder cracking over the neighborhood, rain coming down like a waterfall, and the wind howling like a warning. With the storm knocking trees sideways, I did what any smart person would do. I stayed inside, made some coffee, and turned on the news to keep an eye on what was happening. But right as they started talking about flooding in the area, my screen froze. No signal. Then my phone lost Wi-Fi. I checked the router. Everything seemed fine. But somehow, I was completely cut off. No internet. In the middle of a storm now? I wouldn't be this annoyed if it had been a power issue or weather damage. But when I checked with my neighbor across the street, his internet was perfectly fine. Mine was the only one down. That's when I got suspicious. And sure enough, a quick look at the security cameras showed something that made my jaw drop. Earlier that afternoon while I was at work, the HOA maintenance crew had come onto my property and disconnected my internet cable. No notice, no warning. Just unplugged me from the grid like they had every right to do it. Here's where it gets interesting and where the HOA clearly had no idea what they were messing with. You see, I don't just get my internet like everyone else on the block. I own the private relay tower at the top of the hill behind our houses. That's right, the very tower that provides half the neighborhood with their connection. Mine and the entitled folks on the HOA board just picked the worst possible time to mess with it. So what happened when they realized who actually controlled their precious signal? Well, they weren't ready for what came next to really understand how all this went sideways. You need to know a bit about my setup and the HOA. I work remotely in IT and live in a semi-rural neighborhood where the standard internet providers are, well, terrible. Slow speeds, outages, constant buffering, it just wasn't cutting it. So about 2 years ago, I invested in a private relay tower. It wasn't cheap, but it gave me fast, reliable internet through a dedicated signal. Few neighbors even pitched in, and I let them connect through it for a small fee. It was a win-win for everyone, or so I thought. Now, our HOA has always had this weird superiority complex. They think they own the whole community, down to the color of our mailboxes. Petty rules, surprise fines, even complaints about lawn chairs being too visible from the streets nonstop. And for some reason, they've always had a problem with my tower. At one point, they even sent a letter saying it was an eyesore, even though it's barely visible unless you go looking for it. I appealed, proved it was on private land and met all zoning codes, and thought that was the end of it. But clearly, some grudges don't go away. Turns out, during the storm, one of the HOA board members decided it was the perfect time to cut the cable running to my router box, claiming it was a hazard. Really? In the middle of a storm? When people depend on internet access for emergency alerts? The nerve of that move honestly floored me. And here's where it gets shady: the board never contacted me. No calls, no emails, no emergency notice. Just silence and a disconnected cable. But what they didn't expect was that by taking me offline, they'd be taking themselves offline too. And the fallout was just beginning. By the next morning, things had taken a turn. My phone lit up with texts from neighbors, some angry, some confused. Their internet had gone down overnight, right when they needed it most. With the storm still raging and power flickering in and out, they were suddenly cut off from weather updates, emergency notifications, even work meetings. A few folks couldn't access their home security systems. People were panicking. And I was still sitting there with no clue what the HOA was planning next. I didn't say anything at first. I wanted to see how far they'd go. I quietly drove up to the tower site, still standing, still humming, but completely shut out from my main hub. I could tell someone had tampered with the access panel at the base. They didn't know how the whole system worked, but they clearly thought cutting my cable would kill the signal. What they didn't realize was the way the system was set up. It rerouted through my property to reach the rest of the network. So by disconnecting me, they had basically unplugged everyone. And here's where the story gets even messier. One of my neighbors, Susan, called me in a panic. Her elderly mom uses a medical alert device that relies on Wi-Fi backup if the landline fails. That night, it failed. She was furious, not just scared. Another neighbor, James, works from home, managing a team overseas. His connection dropped in the middle of a critical deadline. Now, people were asking questions. Why did only half the neighborhood lose internet? Why did the other half stay online? And why did it all seem to trace back to my house? Meanwhile, the HOA was suspiciously quiet. No apology, no update, nothing. It was like they hoped no one would trace it back to them. But that silence. It was about to explode because I had receipts, cameras, and something they didn't know yet. I wasn't just another homeowner. I was the backbone of their connection. By midweek, the neighborhood was buzzing offline and angry. The HOA had dug themselves into a hole, but they were still pretending everything was normal. I stayed quiet, but behind the scenes, I was pulling together the timeline. The footage from my security cameras clearly showed the maintenance guy, wearing an HOA vest, on my property without permission, snipping the line. A few frames later, he was on a phone call, nodding as if following orders. That gave me chills. Someone high up told him to do it. This wasn't a random mistake, it was planned. Meanwhile, the complaints kept rolling in. Susan had filed a formal grievance with the HOA. James was threatening legal action for lost work. Others started connecting the dots how all the internet problems seemed to start when my cable was cut. I didn't have to say much. The truth was bubbling up all on its own. Then came the meeting. The HOA called an emergency board session, supposedly to address recent service disruptions. I showed up early, sat quietly in the back, and watched the board squirm. The president of the HOA, Mr. Ellison, looked more nervous than usual. I could tell they were trying to spin the situation. They blamed the storm, claimed it was unfortunate timing. But when a neighbor asked directly if they had cut any cables as a precaution, Ellison paused just a little too long. That's when I stood up. I didn't raise my voice. I just calmly asked if the board was aware they had damaged equipment they didn't own, equipment tied to a private network. And then I dropped it. The tower was mine. The connection died. Interfered with. I had the license, the data, and the legal paperwork. The room went silent. Faces went pale. I hadn't even shown them the video yet, and they had no idea. What was coming next, just when the room thought things couldn't get any worse for the HOA? I pulled out one more card, something even I hadn't planned on using unless they tried to deny everything. I calmly reached into my bag, pulled out a printed document, and slid it across the table to Mr. Ellison. It was a copy of the contract signed 2 years ago, when the HOA had actually approached me for a service extension deal. That's right, they once asked for stronger internet coverage for common areas like the clubhouse and pool surveillance system. And instead of paying a provider, they quietly agreed to tap into my network under the radar, without informing the rest of the community. The board members looked at each other, realizing I'd just exposed something bigger than a cable being cut. This wasn't just about a petty grudge anymore. It was about the HOA knowingly damaging infrastructure they relied on and then trying to bury it. Some homeowners in the room gasped, recognizing the document format as official HOA paperwork. I didn't need to say anything more. The expressions said it all, and then came the twist I hadn't seen coming. A woman from the back of the room stood up. I'd seen her around, usually quiet, always polite. She introduced herself as Linda, a former board secretary who'd stepped down months ago. She cleared her throat and said, "There's more. You're not the only one they've targeted." Suddenly, the spotlight wasn't just on MIT, was on years of buried tension. She claimed the board had a history of going after homeowners who challenged them, manipulating rules, and even editing meeting notes to erase objections. Now, the atmosphere in that meeting wasn't just tense, it was volatile. The community wasn't just upset about the internet outage anymore. They were beginning to realize they'd been played for much longer than one stormy night. And this time, no quiet apology would fix it. It all started on a quiet Saturday morning. My wife and I were outside, just enjoying our little patch of sunshine, trimming the hedges and planting some flowers. Nothing fancy, just a peaceful morning like we always hoped for when we moved into this neighborhood. But peace doesn't last long when your next-door neighbor is the queen of entitlement. Yep, Karen, the self-declared ruler of the cul-de-sac, came storming over with that familiar scowl on her face and her yappy little dog in tow. She was convinced again that we had somehow crossed the invisible line between our lawns, claiming we had stolen her grass. At first, my wife tried to stay calm, polite even, reminding Karen that the property lines were clearly marked. But Karen wasn't having it. Her voice got louder, and before we knew it, she was stepping up, finger in my wife's face, demanding we move our stuff back before things get ugly. What Karen didn't know, though, was that she just picked a fight with the wrong person, because my wife, she's a professional MMA fighter, calm, focused, and trained to keep her cool under pressure. But that doesn't mean she's someone you want to push too far. The thing is, we never wanted trouble. We moved here for peace, to get away from the noise and the drama. But somehow, trouble found us anyway in the form of an entitled neighbor who thought intimidation would get her way. What happened next wasn't what anyone expected. Karen's attitude hit a wall she didn't see coming. And let's just say things didn't go as she planned. Stick around, because what happened after that argument in the yard will leave you speechless. Trust me, won't want to miss how this showdown really ended. To really understand how things got to that point, you need to know a bit more about Karen and why this wasn't her first outburst. Since the day we moved in, she had a habit of finding something to complain about, whether it was where our trash cans were placed, how loud our wind chimes sounded, or even how often we watered our plants. She acted like the whole street was her personal kingdom, the lawn space thing. That was just her latest excuse to stir up drama. Now, my wife, Sarah, isn't just some tough fighter. She's got years of discipline under her belt, a black belt in jiu-jitsu, and a calm head that most people would envy. But she's also someone who values respect, especially in her own home. We'd both tried to be friendly when we first moved in. Brought over cookies, said hello, the whole neighborly routine. Karen just gave us side eyes and slammed her door. So over time, we stopped trying. The lawn in question was just a small patch, not even worth the fuss. A corner where our garden slightly met hers near the sidewalk, with a few potted plants. But Karen swore we were creeping in, and this morning, she came out like she was ready for battle. She didn't expect my wife to stand her ground without even raising her voice. That's when things really started to shift. Karen's yelling turned into wild accusations, saying we were threatening her property, even though all we were doing was pulling weeds. Neighbors peeked out from windows, pretending not to watch, but everyone could feel the tension growing. It was like the calm before a storm, and no one really knew what Karen would do next. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that Sarah wasn't someone you could push around. And Karen was about to find that out the hard way. Karen stepped even closer, her face red and voice sharp, waving her phone in the air like it was some kind of weapon. "I'm calling the HOA." She snapped, like that threat alone would make us shrink. But honestly, we weren't worried. We had already spoken to the HOA months ago and had written proof that the lawn line was exactly where we kept it. Still, Something about the way Karen looked at Sarah made my stomach twist. Oh, guys. It wasn't just annoyance anymore, it felt personal. Like she needed to prove something as Karen dialed and shouted into her phone. A few neighbors began to drift outside, pretending to take out trash or walk their dogs. It was subtle, but we saw it. Mrs. Patel from across the street stood by her mailbox, eyes darting between Karen and us. She gave us a small shake of her head, like she'd seen this show before. And that's when another layer of this story came out. Apparently, Karen had done the same thing to a young couple 2 doors down, accused them of breaking zoning rules because they painted their door a color she didn't like. They moved out 6 months later. While Karen ranted on the phone, Sarah stayed grounded. She didn't interrupt, didn't react, just watched with that calm focus I'd seen her use in the ring. But beneath it, I could tell she wasn't just standing up for our lawn. This was about more than space. It was about boundaries, respect, and not letting someone bully their way through life unchecked.